Wait, don't go anywhere. This video will tell you why indirect rule flourished in the northern part of Nigeria, failed partially in the southwest, and failed woefully in the southeast. This video will tell you why the British government used indirect rule in what is known today as Nigeria. Pay attention. Now, what is indirect rule? Indirect rule is a system of administration used by the British colonial administration in dealing with the people by using their traditional rulers, traditional political institutions, cultural and racial structures in dealing with the people as intermediaries, while the British officials mainly advise and where necessary enforce colonial regulations. Now, what you should take in this definition is that indirect rule, the relationship between the colonial masters and the people, is their traditional rulers. Take that as a linchpin information. Now, before we go to why it flourished in the north and failed in the southeast and partially failed in the southwest, let us look at the reasons why the British government adopted indirect rule in what is known today as Nigeria. One of the reasons was inadequate British personnel. There were few Europeans to adequately control areas under British control, so they needed to use our people. Okay, now another reason why they used indirect rule was insufficient fund. Another reason was climate condition. The climate condition was poor. The British people could not survive in it. In fact, they referred to Africa in a derogatory statement. They called this place the white man's graveyard because mosquito dealt with them. Malaria showed them pepper, so they didn't want to come. So they used our people who were already immune to mosquitoes to rule us. Another reason was because of their commercial needs. They wanted to create a market for their goods and services and to encourage West Africans to be the manufacturers of those products. So hence, they brought indirect rule. Another reason was the presence of traditional rulers and their institutions. They used them to rule the people indirectly. Another reason why they used indirect rule was the role and the position of the traditional rulers, because they found out that what is known as the present day Nigeria in the north, the people respected their traditional rulers. Another reason was because of the large expanse of land, because the northern and the southern protectorate was so large, so they cannot administer direct rule. So they used indirect rule because it was large. Hence, that was why there was the amalgamation in 1914. Another reason why they brought indirect rule in what is known today as Nigeria was because indirect rule was cheap. It was cheaper than direct rule, and it was cheaper than policy assimilation that was used by the Francophone. Another reason why they used it was language barrier. Obviously, they could not speak our language, so they needed our people to help them. So indirect rule became necessary. Another reason was poor communication system. There was poor communication and transportation system. Hence, it facilitated the need for indirect rule. Now, since we have done with the need, let us look at the reasons why indirect rule flourished in the north. One of the reasons why it flourished in the north was the preservation of the existing cultures. The British government was not interested in changing the people's culture. They were interested in exploitation. So they did not disturb the northerners about their culture. Because of that, the people did not pay much interest in them, so they accepted indirect rule. Another reason why it flourished in the north was because of centralization of power. Most of the emirs were authoritarians, and no one dared to question their authority. But despite that, the system was still stable. So the white men saw that the system was stable and they used indirect rule on them, and it worked. Another reason why it worked in the north was illiteracy. Education makes a man to know his right and to seek redress when this right is being violated and being trampled upon. No doubt about it. With all due respect, the pre-colonial administration of the Fulani Hausa pre-colonial days, the people were not educated, and so they could not know their rights and when it's being trampled upon, so they could not challenge or question the system. So indirect rule flourished in the north. Another reason was religion. Remember that in the early 19th century, Uthman Dan Fodio had already come. He had already conquered Harbe and introduced Islam, and adherents to Islam saw their leaders as someone who is divinely sent. Hence, submission and respect is necessary for a true believer, and that propagated the tenet of indirect rule. So indirect rule flourished. Another reason was because the people were fully subjected, fully respective. The people respected constituted authorities, and the white men knew this. So they used their people, their constituted authority, to rule the people indirectly. Another reason was because the British officials promoted the northern leaders. So because of that promotion, they were so willing to continue with indirect rule. So indirect rule flourished in the north because the people were so subjective to constituted authority and respected their leaders. And all these things were the factors why it flourished in the north. Now let's go to the south. Why it partially failed in the west and woefully failed in the southeast among the Igbos. One of the reasons was the people were not fully subjected to their leaders. They respected their leaders, but to question unrealistic decisions that were made by their leaders. Authoritarianism, dictatorship was never allowed. Another reason was religion. Listen, Christianity was beginning to saturate in the south. The people were becoming Christians, and you know that Christianity in its nature is democratic, so there was no room for indirect rule. Another reason was education. Education was beginning to become widespread in the southwest and in the southeast, and the people embraced education. And remember what education does. Education makes a man unfit to be a slave. The people know their right, and they seek redress when this right is being trampled and violated upon. Another reason was the system of tax collection. Remember, in the north, they were already paying tax before the white men came. There were systems included. There were people there. In my previous video, I told you had the Wazili, the Madawaki, the Baji. You had the Gradimo. You had the striking rod, the striking power, the striking father. So the northerners were collecting tax. But here in the southeast and in the southwest, especially in the southeast, they were never paying tax to anybody. They were in charge of their institutions. Okay, so when the white men came to impose taxation, they refused. Hence, what did the white people do? They brought indirect rule, and the people could not take it. So they used warrant chiefs, using their people to collect taxations from them. And the southeasterners hated warrant chiefs. That was what Chinua Achebe tried to portray in Things Fall Apart. Okonkwo had to cut the head of one of the officials. Now, one of the reasons why it did not work again was because of decentralization. The southeast was not centralized, it was decentralized. Remember that the Igbos were Archifeders in nature and practiced a regimented system of government. The people practiced democracy, direct democracy. So indirect rule could not work with them. Another reason why indirect rule never worked in the south was because of checks and balance. There was a presence of check and balance. Another reason why it never worked in the southeast was because the British government did not recognize the educated elites. They would only recognize their traditional rulers because the educated elites were able to question the system and never wanted to be trampled upon. So indirect rule never worked in the southeast. It partially worked in the southwest and failed woefully in the southeast. These are factual, but the irony and the paradox of these things are that indirect rule is still alive in our society today, because indirect rule is the junior brother to neocolonialism. Indirect rule is the cousin to imperialism. Hence, freedom is essential. You accepting these facts does not make your ethnicity or your tribe less conspicuous or to appear less unique and attractive. No, you accepting these facts makes you learned and educated. Remember, a snake that does not shed its skin will die. The same thing happens to a mind that does not unlearn to learn. Africa, Nigeria, remember that wisdom is the principal thing.